I want to welcome all of you to our new installment of the regular series that I host as the curator of the James Smith Noel Collection, series entitled Reader Meets Author, where we bring exciting authors who publish recent, fresh takes on historical problems and discuss their publications, discuss history, and then allow the readers to participate in the discussions. All our interviews will be are recorded and then posted on our YouTube channel. So if you missed this opportunity, you can always look it up. My guest today is a historian of Latin America, a good friend by the name Professor Marco Cabrera Geserick. And let me bring him on the board right here. Let's see here. Marco, can you turn on your video and join us?
Thank you very much, Alex.
Hold on. Let me properly introduce you. Yeah, I know you're eager to start. Dr. Marco Cabrera Geserick is currently assistant professor of history at Gustavus Adolphus College, which is one of the distinguished liberal arts colleges in the nation. And he's been there just recently, isn't it? This is what, second year you've been there?
Yes.
Second year. Before that, he received his PhD at Arizona State University. He has taught at High Point University, Rhodes College, Augustana College. He specializes in Latin American history, especially Central American history, the story of nation making and nationalism. And he recently published a very interesting study that highlighted the complex phenomena of Latin American, both nationalism, nation making, and this intertwining of colonialism and the strife for freedom. The title of his book is the Filibusters, War. It's about intersection of the remarkable phenomena that took place in the 19th century that continues to reverberate through this through the Costa Rican history. But his book is more than just Costa Rica. His book is really about exploring national identity and what it means in Central America. So without further ado, I want to bring Dr. Cabrera Geserick on board and ask him a couple of questions so we can keep the ball rolling. And the first question I have for you is, what is your framework for discussing nationalism? How do you understand this phenomena of nationalism?
Thank you very much, Alex, and also thank you to the James Smith Noel Collection for sponsoring this event. The framework I use actually is based on the study of cultural history, and most specifically to the area of memory studies. Of course, connected as well to the theories of the foundation of nation states, especially during the 1800s, the modern nation state. And for this, of course, I use several authors that actually, what is interesting about this study, this book that I work on, is that actually I studied the Filibuster War from the standpoint of precisely this framework. Authors like the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg, and also his reference to Antonio Gramsci, the work of Eric Hobsbawm, also Maurice Halbach, which is not a historian necessarily, he's a sociologist, or was. And their ideas about collective memory, about the creation of national identity, and also the consolidation of the nation state. And of course, in order to consolidate a nation state, you have to consolidate a national narrative. So this is where all these elements of creating commemorations and are so relevant to create a national identity. As was said, in the late 1800s, when finally Italy was unified, well, now we made Italy. now we have to make Italians. So that's kind of where this is going.
That's right. Now, among the scholars that you just mentioned, I think you missed Benedict Anderson, whom you are mentioning in your own work as essentially as a guide for your own methodological approach to nationalism. Can you elaborate on this?
Right. Benedict Anderson actually it works a little bit on the term or the concept of imagined communities, which of course also has to do with with the creation of the concept of the nation state. What is fascinating is that his book, well, let's first remember that that Anderson is actually not a Latin Americanist, that he was working actually on Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia, but because the political issues in that country, he had to actually recenter his analysis. And then he found out something to do in Latin America, and he just developed this theory of imagined communities, which is the idea in his book, at least to make it short, that the use of the press in books of published works, what he called print capitalism, was very important for the creation of national identity in Latin America. In the Latin America, it's a good example in that sense, because we have a region that used to be part of the Spanish Empire. People consider themselves to be of Spanish or loyal to the Spanish Empire. It didn't matter your ethnicity. Also, matters of ethnicity by that time already were complicated because in Latin America, people are mostly mixed. Of course, there are groups that are not that mixed, but in the large majority by the 1800s already was, more than 50% of the people was. So you are not necessarily married to a specific ethnicity only. You can be from several ethnicities at the same time. So suddenly separating from Spain creates this issue of what are we now? How do we, as in the case of Italians, how do we create this new identity? And of course, the first problem was to create the nation. The nation, of course, has to do with territory. It has to do with certain symbols. So it's fascinating how countries in Latin America very fast, very sudden, go into creating a constitution, creating coins, giving a name to the country, creating a national anthem, creating a flag, all these symbols that give you the sense of civic nationalism. And this is what Benedict Anderson is talking about when he mentions the concept of the imagined communities. Of course, what he says is that geography on one hand, but also the access to certain kind of documents, newspapers and some other kind of public publications, help for people to actually create this sense of community. When I talk about this to my students, I always give the example, we live in St. Peter, Minnesota, that's where Gustavus Adolphus is located. And I tell them that this is actually a valley that if you go back 200 years ago, will have a very different kind of connection. And possibly if you're in St. Peter, it would be hard for you to get out of this town. Maybe a couple of towns that are 2 or 3 miles away, maybe to a town that is 10 or 15 miles away, but that's it. So possibly if you are reading any newspaper, it will be the newspaper of the area. And that means that, yes, you're receiving some international news, but mostly what you are reading is what is happening in these towns, in this valley. And that's your main identity. You start to identify as somebody from St. Peter, but also from the valley. The people of the valley is your family somehow, and possibly they are actually family as well, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is important because some of the first newspapers in Latin America actually follow this. One of the first newspapers during the colonial period in Peru was called the Mercurio Peruano, Peruvian Mercury. So it's kind of saying, wait, so you already have a name for this region? Mm-hmm. In Argentina, there was a newspaper that actually started to call the people of Argentina Argentinians. This is important to understand. The name Argentina hasn't been invented yet. Mm-hmm. But because, as you know, the river La Plata means silver in Latin is Argentum. So they start to call people Argentinian. So the term Argentinian comes into existence before the use of Argentina. So that's what he's saying, that people start to create a sense of community separate from the Spanish Empire, even when they still belong to the Spanish Empire, which they are going to carry after the process of independence.
Well, the title of your book is The Legacy of the Filibuster War. So my next question deals with the starting point for the national narrative that you're dealing with, and that is the Filibuster War. What was it?
The Filibuster War was a very, very important event in the history, not only of Central America, but even the United States in the 1850s, which, interesting enough, or conveniently enough, is not remembered in US history anymore.
But it's part of that awkward colonial
Indeed.
narrative that United States never engaged in.
Indeed, it's part of the process of manifest destiny. It has a lot to do with this process of civil war in the United States and state slaves and in the non-slave states. And in this, what is going to happen is that there's a series of filibuster invasions to Latin America already happening in the early 1800s. The one that we're talking about, the Filibuster War, is the most important filibuster expedition. And here I want to clarify, I'm not talking about the US Senate, right? This term, the filibuster, is used in a different way. Interesting enough, it comes from the Filibuster War. Mm-hmm. The Filibuster War is the one that actually creates that term later. But anyway, the point is that these are just, as they presented themselves as soldiers of fortune, which is kind of a mercenaries, if you want. The term filibuster actually comes from the Spanish filibustero, which is kind of like a land pirate. So these are people that are not attacking boats. They're attacking land and taking over this piece of land, but they are privates in the sense that they are not representatives of a government, right? They are private armies, private entities.
And there is a wonderful individual, kind of wonderful in a sarcastic way, in a sense of filibustering, wonderful, of William Walker, who is an American physician, lawyer, but also a filibuster who embarks on this remarkable project in Central America, which directly affects the destinies of Central American nation states.
Indeed, William Walker actually, this was not the first adventure. He already tried to conquer parts of Mexico. He actually founded the Republic of Sonora in Baja California. He failed. But 2 years later, he decided to go again, and he found the opportunity in Nicaragua. When I was saying that he was the most successful filibuster before, is some books actually called him the king of the filibusters. And the reason is that he was the only one that actually accomplished something, in the sense that he was able to invade Nicaragua and became the military dictator of Nicaragua. Basically, he called himself the president of Nicaragua, and he calls himself a Nicaraguan, interesting enough, after that. But of course, the invasion of Walker and his filibusters to Central America caused the panic of all the rest of the countries there, which little by little are going to start to unite and form an alliance to actually expel him. It was hard because he was expelled first in 1857. He's going to come back in 1858. And then finally, he's going to come back in 1860 when he's finally captured and executed. As you can see that he was, how I can say it, insistent.
Yes. But the importance of the story in your book is that it is the starting point for the story of nation making when it comes to Costa Rica. And the way you craft this book is by focusing on a fascinating hero, unlikely hero, right? Juan Santamaria, a soldier who, through self-sacrifice, right, in this war, tries to contribute to the victory of the Walker. And remarkably, when I was reading, I was struck by the fact that, two facts really. One is that he's forgotten for close to 31 years, only to be rescued from the obscurity. But second, and it related, is that Costa Rica today is, I think, well known for the fact of being disarmed nation, right? They are a nation that gave up military, and yet one of its core national heroes, and the hero with a monument, which is clearly with military undertones, is that of Juan Santamaria. So here we have a military hero in a nation that has removed its military. So how do you deal with this phenomenon?
That's actually one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because you can work on some ideas connected to national identity and collective memory in some countries, and the story is very straightforward. You know, there's a group, an elite that decides to create a figure that promotes certain values, and that figure and those values and those commemorations stay forever. The case of Juan Santamaria is a very, very difficult process. So what happens with the Filibuster War is that Costa Rica didn't have a war of independence. Costa Rica actually kind of received the news of independence when it was part of the Kingdom of Guatemala, and it didn't really have to fight for it. So what happens is that this is the first war in which Costa Rica really has to defend its territory of being conquered. And therefore, because all the blood spilled, all the suffering, at the end of the war between the military and civilians, about 10% of the population died. So that means that actually was very traumatic for Costa Ricans. And of course, they needed to remember this as a great sacrifice for the patria, for the fatherland. So what is going to happen with Santa Maria is that, yes, he's actually a humble soldier. In fact, he is a drummer in the army. And he actually takes a decision to sacrifice himself by actually burning one of the buildings in which the filibusters were protecting themselves, kind of a fort. And he gave his life by doing that. And but again, this is one of many, many actions that happen actually during a battle, right? So very soon he was forgotten. And actually the first holiday celebrated was actually to commemorate the final battle that defeated the filibusters. And it was the president of the nation, Juan Mora, the one that instaurated this holiday. And for some time, it was this holiday, the only one that existed. It was not until about 10 years later that the first mention of his name happened in a speech. Then it would take another 10 years for him to be mentioned in a play. And then it's going to take almost 10 more years for him to finally become the national hero. But I think that he actually, it's an important figure because he's also very different from most national heroes in the Americas and in the world. Mm-hmm. He's not a general. Mm-hmm. He's not a president. He was never a member of the elites. He is the real, what is the term? Unknown hero.
That's right. Very unlikely hero, absolutely. That the contemporaries themselves probably would not have expected him to become a hero of that magnitude. But speaking of this commemoration, how do you deal with the situation, with the issue of having May 1st, the day associated with these commemorations, being later on consumed at the beginning of the 20th century by the rise of labor movements who also embraced May 1st as their own day. Mm-hmm. So you talk about kind of convergence of two different narratives.
This is a fascinating moment. That's why I was saying that actually this is not a straightforward story, and it's very bumpy, and that's why I like it. The case of May 1st, which was a celebration of the final victory over the filibusters, continued all the way up to the 1890s, the early 1900s. But as we know, the late 1800s, May 1st becomes also an important day of celebration for labor movements around the world, precisely because what happened in Chicago in the 1880s. Well, what's going to happen is the labor movements in Costa Rica are going to take this day and going to start to celebrate it as well. By the early 1900s, it's going to become a very important moment. So we have a problem here, because at this moment, the government is controlled by certain elites that actually we have a name for them in Costa Rica, the Olympus. That's the kind of elites that they were. They were untouchable. It's a very small group of families that actually had the control of the intellectual affairs, the cultural affairs, the economic affairs, and the political affairs in the country. So that's why they were called the Olympus. So they were basically deciding what was going on in Costa Rica. And suddenly the labor movement is challenging that. They actually promote the typical liberal values of late 1800s and early 1900s Latin America. That means an export economy, for example, connected to the global market, agricultural exports, directed usually to industrialized markets, especially to the United States. So what is happening is that these elites actually have a very strong commercial and political relation with the United States. On the other hand, we have the labor movements rising, usually anarchists, communists, socialists of different kinds. And usually what they see as the great representative of capitalism is the United States. There's even more. The problem is that Santa Maria and May 1st are celebrating the Costa Rican defeat of US soldiers of fortune.
Mm-hmm.
How can you reconcile that? If the government accepts the celebration of May 1st with the Filibuster War, basically they're allowing for the labor movement to connect both and basically say the Filibuster War was an anti-US war, and therefore we are celebrating that as well. And therefore we, the laborers, the workers, are the new Santa Marias.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a chance for the labor movement to co-opt the image of this nation that the liberal movement is trying to create.
Mm-hmm.
So the fascinating thing is that, what is the solution? Well, 2 years later, the Congress actually passes a new holiday, eliminates all reference in newspapers to May 1st. Yeah. And it's fascinating because just 8 years later, I found in a newspaper a comment that there was a little celebration of May 1st connected to the Filibuster War in a small town. And they were very melancholically saying, oh, this is a really nice memory of a holiday that nobody cares and nobody celebrates about anymore. Just 8 years later, right? So you can see the transformation and the manipulation of politics here, which is fascinating for the creation of a national identity and values, right?
In chapter 3, you have an interesting discussion in this book of the role of history in developing this nation making and that story of what nation is, because in chapter 3 you talk, and I'm looking at my notes about Lorenzo Montufar and his work on Central America, right? The book that he published. But that book was a response, you say, to a book that William Walker himself published, The War in Nicaragua, which was translated in Spanish in 1884. And here you see the what you note in the chapter, that the publication of this book was, quote, perceived as if it was an external threat to Costa Rican national sovereignty. So what role did the historians play in crafting this story of Santa Maria and overall Costa Rican national identity?
Well, that's a great question. And it says a lot about how historians also have understood what history is through the ages, right? Lorenzo Montufar was part of that group of historians that were more into the process of creating this romantic nationalism of the 1800s, creating the nation, right? So Montufar, interesting enough, he was Guatemalan. He was not Costa Rican. Mm-hmm. But the president at that time, Bernardo Soto, actually saw with a great concern the publication in Spanish in Nicaragua, actually, of Walker's book. Walker published this originally before he died in 1860. So it was translated into Spanish. And of course, in Costa Rica, very few people speak English, and especially at that time, even fewer. So that was not a big threat. But suddenly it's published in Spanish. So that means Costa Ricans can read it. And of course, if you think on the terms of creating this national narrative as a state, the Costa Rican government cannot allow that narrative to become the dominant narrative. And therefore, we have to create our own narrative of what happened. And that's where Montufar comes in. He actually lived in Costa Rica many, many years. Interesting enough, he was one of the proposers of the celebrations of May 1st in Costa Rica. So yes, he's going to be assigned by the government of Costa Rica to actually write this book on William Walker. And the fascinating thing is actually it's a very interesting book because he uses a lot of primary sources that he finds not only in Costa Rica, but in all of Central America and even in Colombia, a lot of primary documents that right now are very hard to find. So as a historian, I have to recognize his work. And but of course, it's part of this romantic nationalism that is needed to be created at that time. We're going to see that that's going to change a little bit. But in the 20th century, we say historians continue to actually talk about Juan Santa Maria. There's a controversy in the 1920s, for example, in which there's a challenge by members of the Congress saying that actually Santa Maria never existed, that he was fiction. Indeed. And who has to come to the rescue? Historians. Mm-hmm. So historians are actually going to look for documents and that prove, his act of baptism, a document that actually gave a pension to the mother of Santa Maria after he died, and some other documents to show that he not only existed, but actually he is the relative of these and these people. These other people met him. So you can see historians being very important for that. Later, actually, there was a challenge to some of these ideas. Again, that Juan Santamaria, maybe there were several Juan Santamarias, which is true. There were several Juan Santamarias, and that maybe none of them actually died in this story, burning this building and all, sacrificing himself.
Yes.
Well, in the 1980s, another historian actually found a document that proves definitely that the Juan Santamaria we are talking about, that is specifically from the town that we have been talking about, is the one that actually sacrificed to win this battle. And lately, I think that I am part of this group, but it's a larger group of Costa Rican historians have been also trying to analyze the Filibuster War from the standpoint of a cultural history, right? There's an interest in, for example, also the female participation in the war. There's also an interest, a little bit of military history as well is coming into this. That has not been done before. So in the last years, you can see a new analysis coming from that perspective. So yes, definitely historians are not only rescuing the memory that serves the state, but also challenging all those different narratives from other times.
The subtitle of your book, right, the main title is The Legacy of the Filibuster War, but the subtitle is The National Identity and Collective Memory in Central America. But you craft the book, however, based on the Costa Rican case study. So how can we apply what this lesson of Costa Rican national identity to neighboring countries, especially to Nicaragua, since we've seen the intersection of Costa Rica and Nicaraguan history throughout this book?
Right. This book actually responds to an attempt I had on doing a study of all Central America. I knew from the beginning that it was going to be very hard to work in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, because the memory of this war stays alive in Costa Rica and Nicaragua, basically. Those are the only two countries that have a commemoration, that have national heroes based on this war. I found out that, for example, in Guatemala, there's a statue dedicated to one of the main generals of the Filibuster War, but it's dedicated to him, not to the war. So in the plaque that is under his statue, he mentions the Filibuster War as one of the events in which he participated, but it's not the main one. And that basically is it, nothing else. In El Salvador and Honduras, you can find something very similar. Well, not even statues. Now, in Nicaragua, you can find a lot of information as well. But what is interesting is that when I started to do this work, I found out that actually a Costa Rican historian, Patricia Ephemeral, did a great work analyzing the Nicaraguan case. I went to Nicaragua, I looked in the archives, I looked on newspapers and some other documents, and I found out that what I could do with her work was to expand a little bit, but not to introduce anything that was really relevant, really new. So I decided then to actually keep the title. I think it's fair because all Central American countries participated and some of them remember these events in one way or the other. But then I realized also that just the Costa Rican information was a lot to cover a whole book. So what I decided to do was to actually concentrate this information I just gave you in the conclusion. So more than half of the conclusion considers these different memory studies that have been done in Nicaragua, in other countries, but it tells you a little bit also of the political uses of cases like the Filibuster War. How in Costa Rica it has been a contested narrative. Well, Nicaragua it has been a very clear narrative without many issues, except after 1979, when there was a new war and a new revolution that is going to gain predominance. So of course, the Filibuster War is not now the most important celebration in Nicaragua anymore. So as you can see, it's also part of the old national narrative. We have a new one that they are developing that is not connected to the Filibuster War.
Speaking of which, on page 92, which is part of chapter 5, you talk about this conundrum kind of situation of a contradiction, quote, contradiction between official military discourse in the presence of a national hero of a military background in a country without an army. How much of this is the contradiction of post-1940s political reality? Or do we see this contradiction in earlier eras when was the Santamaria an awkward figure for pre-1948, or is it non-issue in post-1948?
I think it kind of develops little by little. 1948, by the way, for the audience, is the year in which Costa Rica abolishes the army. So of course that is a before and after. What happens with the military is in Costa Rica is that although it had a very impressive military in the 1800s by its size, it starts to reduce the military little by little. And by 1948 is a very small amount of soldiers that they have anyway. So the shift from there to abolish it is not that strong. The image of Santa Maria before 1948 fits well because the image of Santa Maria is of the common soldier. It's not a general, it's not a president, it's a common soldier, and therefore it's the image of the Costa Rican going to war and defending the fatherland, right? So it fits very well, especially for young soldiers, for the common soldier. This is what they want to be. But after 1948, little by little, things start to change. It's true that the army is abolished in 1948, but actually there are a couple of other conflicts in which there are remnants of the old military weapons, that are used in some confrontations. There's a very short invasion from Nicaragua in 1955 and so on. Mm-hmm. But little by little, the country actually starts to lose the memory of the army. And this is part of the same discussion that we have about the collective memory. What happens, and this actually Pierre Nora mentions it in his analysis of the lieu de mémoire, that actually once the generation that lived the event passes, then the next generations are going to have a memory of it that can be, that is malleable. And you need sites of memory and specific symbols to contain that memory. So what is happening here is that by the 1960s, to still talk about Santa Maria as a soldier is not strange. Why? Because a large majority of the people in Costa Rica saw an army, saw weapons in the streets, they understand what war is. I think it's not until the 1990s, so 40 something years after that, that we have a new generation. The students that are parading, they are at the most 18 years old. They have no idea of what a war is. Their parents, neither. Their parents may be in their 40s. They were not even born in 48. Maybe the grandparents. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of memory, but it's not the main issue. Mm-hmm. And also the divisions that were created in 48, the political divisions kind of also started to diminish in the 1990s. It was not so important to be from one party or the other anymore.
Yes. Let me build on this issue because in chapter 4 you talk about the role of Jose Figueres, and you explain in Jose Figueres you explain that he was the leader of the insurgents in this 1940 civil war, I think 48 civil war, and then he became the leader of the junta. And one of the things that he did after being elected the leader of the National Liberation Party was to try to craft a new celebration, mm-hmm. essentially to supplant, right, the May 1st celebration with the March 20, right, holidays in memory of another battle. But that didn't work. So why?
That's a fascinating case, and that's why I also published a chapter about it, because this is one of the attempts that we see, usually the attempts that we see on the elites of the government of creating a new national holiday to establish a connection with the government and with the values of the government, especially after a military victory. Usually there are successful stories. This is one of the very few stories of failure. And that's again why I love what is happening in Costa Rica. It's fascinating, and it shows all the different examples. I'm not making this up, and that's what I love. It is just I discovered by searching the celebrations of the centenary mm-hmm. of the war, so 1856 to 1956. I started to find out something very strange, which was the insistence of Figueres in connecting the centenary of the Filibuster War with the War of 1955. To reconnect with what we're talking about. In 1948, the National Liberation Movement actually wins the war. It's a very short-lived civil war. And he becomes the president of the junta. Mm-hmm. Later, he is elected president also of Costa Rica 2 more times in the 50s and then in the 70s. And Figueres actually also has to confront an invasion of Costa Ricans, because the losing party, a lot of the members of that losing party went to exile. They joined with dictator Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua, and they invaded Costa Rica in 1955. So the same division, the party division, continued to exist in 55. They were defeated again. So Figueres, to commemorate this and the people that died in 1955, decides to use a new date, March 20. Why? Because one of the main battles in which he won was the Battle of Santa Rosa, a real hacienda in the northern part of Costa Rica. Well, it happens that the first battle that Costa Rica, in which the Costa Ricans defeated the filibuster, was in the Santa Rosa hacienda.
And so essentially he tries to legitimize himself, right? And supplant the first narrative with a new narrative.
This is also important to understand that Figueres was not a member of the traditional elites. He was the son of two immigrants. So he has no connection to the traditional political groups. So in order to, this is the kind of people that have to claim some kind of legitimacy that is not a traditional one that means belonging to a specific party or a specific movement for generations, right? So because that, he has to find some legitimacy, and this is what he does. He is the creator of this Second Republic, and let's create a celebration that connects, and this is something that actually Eric Hobsbawm mentions, that in order to create new traditions, you have to actually always go back and connect the new with the past. That's what he's doing. His new republic, his new values, his new nation, the new national narrative has to be connected somehow to the old national narrative that everybody accepts. And that's why he tries to connect both holidays, but of course, he fails.
Yes. To go back to this issue again of national identity and collective memory, how unique is the Costa Rican case?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I have been studying, of course, the theory of memory studies and collective memory. I study actually certain cases, but I think it's the Costa Rican case is very, very unique, and you can see it almost immediately. Basically on the questions that I actually present in this book. One of the first questions, actually, you already mentioned it, was why is Costa Rica celebrating a soldier if they don't have an army? That was very strange for me because yes, most other countries have soldiers as heroes and generals, but they have a military. So it's understandable what's going on here. And then why the change of holiday so many times? Why the attempt of Figueres to change the holiday again? Which, if you think about it, in most countries in the Americas, the main day that they celebrate is one single day, and the narrative is very clear. It's the birth of the nation. It's Independence Day. Costa Rica doesn't have that. Costa Rica does not celebrate Independence Day. The Filibuster War became the substitute Independence War, if you want.
But how did you connect to the September 15th celebration then?
The September 15th celebration, well, September 15th is the day that actually independence was signed in Guatemala. Basically, Guatemala, remember that all Central America used to be one
but it's not necessarily Costa Rican, right, as such, right? Because I think there was looking through your writings, I see these references to these competing narratives of September 15, which was celebrated as opposed to May 1st. But what you're saying is May 1st is uniquely Costa Rican, and it is around it, right, that you craft the narrative of us being unique, or Costa Ricans being unique. In the book, you mention, and I quote, the Filibuster War's most important legacy is mostly intangible. What do you mean by this?
What is fascinating is that when we talk about this concept of the lieu de mémoire, the site of memory, we usually think about statues. We think about stamps. We think about coins, in all these kind of material ways to actually repeat and reinforce the ideas and the values connected to a specific concept of national identity. But in Costa Rica, what happens is that a lot of this memory of the war has been kept inside Costa Ricans with stories that actually allow them to actually even challenge the stories and the values that the government and the elites are promoting. So these are also a fascinating case that we usually only in Costa Rica. In the 1990s, there were a lot of protests against the government. And the Costa Ricans, because they saw the government as inefficient and corrupt, they started to point out at the government as the new filibusters,
Yeah.
which is turning around the table, absolutely. So when I say it is intangible, it's because the Costa Ricans own the narrative now. It's not something that is imposed and that, oh, in order to be Costa Rican, I have to believe these ideas. No, they own it and they transform it at their own taste and depending on the political situation. So they live this. They understand. They refer to the filibuster as the enemy in general, and they refer to Santa Maria as the hero and the aspirations of being the hero and, of course, fighting against the filibuster all the time.
Now, Costa Rica began as a small nation. And in your book, you underscore how small really Costa Rica was, just a few 100,000. And you see then its growth, especially in the second half of the 20th century, in post 1950s, the demilitarization, the growing prosperity. Now it's a nation of several million people, I think, 5 million or so. Many of them immigrants, right? Many of them newcomers. So how is there a continued relevance of the memory of Santa Maria, of that national myth-making to the new current Costa Ricans? Or is it something that is perceived to be as, it happened, it's there, we'll just pass by?
No, this is something that a Guatemalan historian will call lived memory. It's something that you live. And I can attest, or I'm a witness to this, because actually I myself, I'm a migrant. I'm the son of 2 migrants. I moved to Costa Rica, and I don't mean to the US, I mean to Costa Rica. My parents are not Costa Rican originally. My father, he considers himself Costa Rican, but he was born in Guatemala. My mother is German. And I arrived to Costa Rica when I was 6 without speaking a word of Spanish. And of course, at 6, I go to elementary school and I start to learn these stories that for Costa Ricans are so normal. Well, it happens that suddenly the only way to become Costa Rican and to understand Costa Rican is to get involved into this. One of my dreams in elementary school and high school was to be part of the parade. And I did it. I accomplished it.
You mean May 1st parade, right?
I was in those parades and I was a drummer. It's important. So it's part of becoming Costa Rican. It's not an old story. It's part of becoming Costa Rican, and it's part of understanding also the Costa Rican mentality. It's also Costa Ricans have actually one of the features that they have is that the concept of that we are all equal. And they don't mean it in a rhetorical way. It's actually pervasive in the sense that Santa Maria is one of us because he's one of us. And what I'm trying to say here is he's just one of the people. And therefore, that's why he can be a hero. Otherwise, we would not like him as a hero. And the same is with everybody else. In Costa Rica, you cannot really show that you are making a lot of money. You cannot show that you have a lot of power. You can have it. Don't show it. They don't like that. Everybody is equal, and you have to respect everybody in the same way. So you can see that reflected on the image of Santa Maria. And of course, that's why, but you as an immigrant learn very, very soon, right?
We have a question that one of the listeners asked, and it is, how did the filibusters see the people, the land that they were trying to conquer? Was it as a tabula rasa, or as people, a place that just needed the leadership?
It's the typical concept of manifest destiny connected to the ideas of regeneration. And actually, these are ideas that they learn in the expansion to the West. In fact, one of the terms that they used in a couple of letters to refer to the Costa Ricans are greasers, which is the same term, exactly. The same term that was applied first to the indigenous people in the United States, and then later to Mexican people during the 1848 war. So you can see there's a repeating here. But there's also this idea of regeneration, right? We are, that's a concept of the filibuster. We are a superior race. We know how to make the land and the country prosperous. And therefore, since these people don't know what they are doing, we should actually show them how. But the interesting thing is that we will show you how by expelling you. because the goal of William Walker was very clear. He wanted to keep the indigenous people and the people of African descent as slaves. So he wanted to reinstate slavery. And everybody that was what we consider now Latinos or mixed background were going to be expelled of the country. So he says it very clearly in his newspapers. So it's it's the idea of regeneration that is typical of the manifest destiny or mission civilisatrice concept, right?
The concluding chapter, you talk broadly about the importance of filibuster war, not just for Costa Rica, but for Central America overall. And in over the last half an hour or so, we talked about Costa Rica and Nicaragua. But what about other nations? You mentioned in passing that maybe they were not affected as much, or they didn't retain the memory of it. So what was the nation-making myth for them then?
Right, that's interesting. That's a very interesting question.
Is it? Do they go all the way back to the Napoleonic era and the struggles that emerged from the collapse of the Spanish Empire?
Indeed, the most important concept of, especially for Guatemala, Guatemala is interesting because they continue to see themselves in certain areas. Of course, not always, not all people. They continue to see themselves as the old capital of the province. For them, the other territories are just supposed to be part of Guatemala. They just don't know it, right? That's kind of the notion. So for them, the important day was September 15. That's the holiday they have celebrated and continue to celebrate. And the same happens also with Guatemala and El Salvador. Actually, something that you can find very interesting is that they have also a lot of connections to the old Federal Republic of Central America. This was a country that was created just 3 years after independence, uniting all of Central America. And a lot of symbols that they continue to use, like their flags, their coat of arms, and the second national anthem, all those are connected to the old time of the Federation. So they are still stuck, if you want, in that Napoleonic period, right? Or post Napoleonic, which is the independence period in the creation of the first Federation. So that's the national narrative they have.
Interesting. What's your future projects?
Interesting, yeah. Well, I actually had 2 projects in general that I have been working on. One of them is the concept of ephemeral nations. I have been working on that a little bit. I gave a couple of presentations a little bit ago on the conference. Actually, I think that in Shreveport, when I was visiting you, I gave one of those presentations. But
for the listeners, explain what the ephemeral nation is.
Right. It has to do with this period of the Napoleonic era, or post-Napoleonic, if you want, which is the concept of all these new nations being created in Latin America that actually are trying to become a nation, but actually they have a lot of these old values and old notions, and therefore how to separate from those old notions and create a new country. But then a lot of these countries actually collapse very soon. As I just mentioned, for example, the Federal Republic of Central America, it lasted for 13 years, and then it collapsed and partitioned in several countries. But the memory is still there. There are countries still remembering that they were part of the Federation, they still want to reunite, or the other way around. We have regions in Brazil, in Argentina, in Mexico, that were independent nations at a certain point. And they still keep some of that memory. They still keep flags, they still have commemorations of old battles. And these are countries that existed for a very short time. Actually, one that the audience may be more familiar with, it's the Republic of Texas, which lasted for about, 7 years, and then became part of the United States. Yeah. Same thing, they have an identity. They consider themselves Texans before.
Oh yeah, they try to secede every so often.
Exactly, and it's because that memory. And this idea of the ephemeral nations is important because what I am studying is how that identity is kept. Is regional identity something that we should just not listen to, or should we actually listen to it saying, this is not regional identity, this is a national identity under a supranational identity.
Yes.
It can emerge any moment. Yes. So so that's part of what I'm studying. But I have another project which actually is related to the book that we're talking about today. And although I have been following the ephemeral nations for a little bit, the concept, I think I'm going to concentrate on this last one so I can finally publish my second book. And this will be an international history of the Filibuster War.
Wonderful. Now, when you say international, what's the dimensions of the international scale of the filibuster war? Is it still limited to Central America? Do we have filibustering in a wider area?
It's reduced to the actions in Central America and mostly Nicaragua. But what I'm interested in talking about is the international intentions of participation. For example, we talk about the filibusters as independent entities, right? Private citizens. But I would like to remind people in this book how strongly connected to certain politicians, congressmen and ministers, secretaries of state, and some other people in the United States they were. They were really connected, and they were being supported by politicians in the United States. Maybe not officially by the government, yes, but there were some intentions, especially from the South, already thinking on a future secession. Then we can see also the presence of British and French boats on the different ports. And the British especially supported diplomatically Costa Rica. And actually, they also provided weapons for the Costa Rican army. Chile also sent some boats all the way from South America to protect the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. Peru gave a huge loan for Costa Rica to buy weapons that was paid years later. Colombia insisted diplomatically in front of other countries in Europe to actually support Costa Rica against the filibusters and so on. So that's what I'm trying to see. What was the interest of each of these countries in participating in this war? What were they looking at? What was their perception? And one thing that I would like to mention is that, for example, the concept of Latin America emerged precisely from the filibuster war. It was a Chilean poet, the first one that actually, in a poem talking about the Costa Ricans fighting the filibuster war, that mentioned that this is a war for Latin America versus Saxon America. The first time that the term Latin America exists. Spanish America has been used, but it's the first time that Latin America, the term is used and is connected to the filibuster war.
Thank you so much for this wonderful, interesting conversation. So many insights into, how about the crafting of national narrative. I want to remind the listeners we've discussed the book by Professor Marco Cabrera Geserick, The Legacy of Filibusters: War, National Identity, and Collective Memory in Central America. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.